well start. And Larry is you're going to monitor whoever else joins us. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming on. Welcome to the first edition of a new conversation series between Ben Yehuda Press poets. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with R.B. Lemberg, the author of Everything Thaws, that was published with us in 2022, and Roger Kamenetz, the author of The Missing Jew, a new edition of an anthology gathering decades of his Jewish poems, published with us in 2021. Both poets have published wildly beyond those titles. My name is Julia Knobloch. I'm the host tonight, and I've been serving as the poetry editor for Ben Yehuda Press for roughly 2 years. And I had the pleasure of working with both RB and Roger on fine-tuning their manuscripts. And before I joined the team, I had my chapbook, Book of Failed Salvation, published also with Ben Yehuda Press. We have also with us Larry Yudelson, who is the editor-in-chief and Ben Yehuda Press jack of all trades. It's mastermind and heart and soul, and today working behind the scenes, or not behind the scenes, visibly behind the scenes, and taking care of all the technical issues that hopefully we don't have. I also want to mention that we are offering the books of all the three of us for a special discount price that you can find on our website. And it's a package of the books from Roger, RB, and myself. I'll post the link in the chat in just a bit. We planned this event, the kickoff to this new series, a while ago, and then October 7th happened. And we regrouped and we discussed how to move forward. Should we postpone? Until when? When will the war be over and what will that mean? We decided that arguably times of crisis and times of trauma just like these demand different ways of engagement than obsessive social media consumption and potentially toxic discussions, more than checking the news update every 5 minutes. As Rav Art Green writes in his weekly newsletter for this week's Parsha Chaye Sarah, and I'm quoting, "At a time when we still await release of captives, we need a faith of outcry and demand, not of sweetness and light." I, meaning Rav Green, say the opposite. Any teaching that will remind us of who we are in our best moments is vital now. Anything that will help heal our wounded humanity should be welcome. We try to help in any way we can, even from a distance. But at least on Shabbat, we should turn to the source of light. This source for the next 1.5 hours is the purity of poetry. While poetry might be just as powerless as we might feel in the face of evil, it might be better equipped to hold us and spread over us a shelter of, if not peace and healing, but at least stillness and reflection. And I want to thank Roger, who shared the quote from Rav Green just a few hours before we had this meeting. Of course, this conversation is taking place before the backdrop of major political upheaval across the world, and coincidentally, on the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And while I wanted to mention this, I also want to say that we do want to focus on the potential of poetry, maybe on its limits, but definitely on its light. So our being together will last about 1.5 hours. We aim to finish before 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, which is where I am. We'll have a short intro conversation, and then RB will read from their collection. And then we have another conversation. Then Roger will read from his book, or both poets might also read from other collections, but most of the poems will probably be from those books. And then we're having continue the conversation, and you guys have the chance to post questions and comments in the chat, which we will monitor, and then there will be time to address a few selected comments as we wrap up in a Q&A session. So before I introduce RB, I wanted to ask both Roger and RB a short question and that is to give a short description of what you think your poetry does or aims to do, or what it does not do and definitely does not want to do. And I'm aware that this could be a long answer, but maybe something that comes up as essential in this frame of our meeting tonight. So whoever wants to go first, go first.
Roger, you want to go first? Go ahead.
I take dictation. So I just listen for the voice in me that wants to speak that's not generally arises spontaneously when I have the urgency to make a poem. And over time, I've learned to listen to that, and often quite surprised by what that voice has to say, and feel that. So I remember once I had a rabbi in my house and a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and the rabbi was asking all these questions. What's your position on this? What's your position on that? And finally the monk looked at him and said, my position is I have no position. And so, you know, in a way, I think that's also the poet's situation, because we're really trying to access a source of utterance as opposed to saying things. That not all poets do that all the time, and neither do I, but that's my sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was beautiful. What my poetry does, that's such a loaded question. You know, Adorno famously said that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbarism. And I have struggled with this all my life, because what does it even say? We can't write poetry after major catastrophic events that have befallen us or befallen other people. We are silent. And I, as Julia will introduce me, I have immigrated many times. I was born in Ukraine, then moved with my family to subarctic Russia, moved to Israel, and finally moved to the United States. And throughout my life, I've been struggling with an overwhelming feeling of silence, that some things are simply unspeakable. And I think my work pushes against that silence. And there are things that I can only say in poetry, because to say them in daily life, sometimes people default to kind of formulaic ways of saying, which do not really illuminate as much as deep, heartfelt engagement, the cry of the soul. Sometimes, you know, I don't want to be too pathetic about it, but you know, writing poetry sometimes helps me connect to feelings of something transcendent, something that is not only me and is not only the words that I'm making, but something beyond the page. And I think that for me and for many Jewish poets, I think writing poetry in the wake of traumatic events is a way of life. I mean, Jewish history is kind of a cycle with many traumatic events. So when I write poetry, I want to tap into meanings that are not taking positions and are not making political statements, but rather get at the heart of what it means to be human, and what it means to suffer, and what it means to feel compassion. And it helps me connect to those things. What my poetry doesn't do, I don't view my poetry as activism. I don't view my poetry as you know, as making political statements, although I think poetry absolutely can do that, but mine does not, or at least that's not where I'm going with it. Thank you.
Thank you. So from those answers, we can already know that that was just a glimpse of the very interesting conversation that will evolve over the next 1.5 hours. So yes, RB already mentioned, but I am going to introduce a little bit more. So the first poet is RB Lemberg, and RB Lemberg was born in Ukraine and has lived in the Soviet Union and in Israel before immigrating to the US, where they attended grad school at UC Berkeley. In their academic life, Lemberg is a professor of sociolinguistics working on immigrant discourse, identity, and gender. R.B. Lemberg's poems have been described as a, quote, manifesto of memories, unearthing worlds that are gone and present, as an unforgettable cartography of trauma, Jewishness, gender, war, and family history. They will read from Everything Thaws that tracks their childhood in the Soviet Union, suspended between Ukraine and the permafrost of Siberia, among the silent, persecuted members of their Jewish family. Lemberg's coming of age in Israel, being the other wherever they go, both internally and externally, in multiple identities, languages, genders, and the arrival in the, quote, the lost land of their America, where they have put down tentative roots. Please, RB.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Julia. This is my book, and I'm going to read. It's a collection of numbered poems, so I will tell you which number for those who want to follow along. Number 1. And I will read for about 20 minutes, give or take. Number 1. Everything thaws. I learned this lately when the permafrost in Vorkuta started to give way, revealing secrets nobody asked for. Not woolly mammoths or ancient cave artifacts, but bodies of the Gulag prisoners, thrown out, not even buried, because the snow would take care of its own. You could trust the snow back then, and now you can't trust anything. Let me tell you why this matters to me. When I was 4, my father came into the room where I slept and kissed me. It was not my room. We only had 2. Serving is gathering, art, working, sleep space is needed. He thought I was asleep. I was. My spirit hovered by the door, high by the 12-foot ceiling, while I watched him lean over the slats of the bed. He said nothing I could hear, but he loved me, and he was leaving. That was clear, leaving on the train and then on the train again. 3 solid days of travel, going north beyond the Arctic Circle to live for a while in Vorkuta, where once they killed people in the Gulag, but many survived and either did not want or could not leave, among them a distant relative of my mother's, who said he would help my father to find a job and stay there, because the KGB was bothering him here in Ukraine, demanding he inform on his friends, but he would not. A few decades later, I began to write a story about this. The Gulag, to the west of the Ural Mountains, prisoners flew around as willow ptarmigans. There was no Gulag in Europe, a cred partner informed me with the usual confidence of white Americans. She was an expert, you see, having researched Gulags for her own story. She did not know about Vorkutlag, and so it did not exist. She meant no harm, but she kept writing, and I stayed silent. Long after we left Vorkuta, the melting permafrost, which I am witnessing over social media, disturbs me. 2 continents and as many lifetimes ago, my father was happy there. Perhaps nobody else was, but he was, far away from the KGB, not so far from my mother, but far enough. Snug in his wooden studio assigned to him by the Soviet Artists' Union. Among plates of colored glass, among his glass cutters and chisels and his blocks of wood, the snow forever clenching the ground, its vast masses hiding all the dead, there he was, as permanent as permafrost, just as silent but warmer. I do not know how to mourn him in my 5 languages, nothing serves. Across 3 continents, with all my eloquence, nothing serves. With all my silence, nothing serves. For readers who might not believe, there ever was a Vorkuta, a circumpolar town where thousands of Gulag prisoners died of malnutrition and exposure, where architects plotted victory against permafrost, where school children bullied other school children by tying dead lemmings to strings and spinning them about. When I came back to Ukraine after a year in Vorkuta, I drew northern lights to show my classmates. I drew myself dragging a little sleigh head up to the vast shimmering road in the sky. It was my road that showed me the way when I was 6, white, wide, stretching across the black winter sky in complete silence under the immovable permanence of the cold. "You're lying," my classmates yelled, and later the whole class trapped me in the school attic and beat me, screaming that I was a Jew who believed in God. Remember, these were Soviet times, and believing in God was forbidden, and that I was lying about the northern lights I saw in Vorkuta. They have never seen the northern lights, but they knew what a Jew looked like. A Jew looks like me. A Jew looks like this person with too much curly hair and an eating disorder and too many academic degrees and too much change, less than a model immigrant from too many places to too many places, never believing that I will be heard because people have trouble believing that things exist that they have never seen. Every time I open my mouth or flex my fingers to write, I am putting a brave face upon the thawing permafrost. I am not lying. I am just constantly changing languages, idioms, continents, genders, homes, and I am not even sure how to mourn from this vantage, let alone perform any other human activity, let alone be a good anything. A good child, a good immigrant, a good parent, a good spouse, a good writer, only if I'm silent, squeezing my lips shut so tightly, clenching my fingers, always trying to fit, remembering that where I'm from, a Jew cannot be good by definition. A Jew must become a person instead, become a Jew person, and then simply a good Soviet citizen, but secretly a rootless cosmopolitan who never speaks anything but the purest Russian, who eats no herring or raw garlic under any circumstances before going out, because everybody knows that Jews stink of these two things. This is the one permanent axis of my identity, that I'm a Jew, that is a rootless cosmopolitan, at home nowhere, in no language, in no country, not even among other Jews, eating herring and garlic with a sense of deep satisfaction that comes with the hope that living in the Midwest, nobody's going to surreptitiously sniff me for that telltale stench of a Jew, which cannot be spoken of in polite society, cannot be uprooted, cannot be forgotten or forgiven, only silenced. Now we're gonna go to number 6. Maybe 7. Moving in a straight line to the far northeast, to the Ural Mountains, where they forced political prisoners to mine coal and precious stones and big chunks of rock salt, now a museum, Vorkut Lag, the Vorkuta Gulag, that place of ex-convicts, political not and or people looking for Severne, the extra pay due to Soviet workers laboring in subarctic conditions, moving halfway across the continent to escape the KGB because you did not want to betray your friends. But we must never speak of it. Might mean that you'll never have friends again, never allow yourself to get that close to anyone. Retreat to the snow-guarded wooden studio with its mellow heat, the smell of turpentine and sheets of colored glass, and silence. If you don't have any friends, the people in coats won't ask you to betray them. If you leave your child behind in Ukraine to be raised by your mother-in-law, the people in coats will believe that you did not care because they told you they knew you had this child and that the child was 4, and where you lived with this child and where you worked while caring about this child, which is why you need to inform for them. And if you would agree to inform for them to betray your friends, you would have a solo exhibit in East Germany with all your paintings, and so you never complete another painting. The hand does not know why the mind cannot. The mind does not know why the heart keeps refusing, not to lift the brush you endlessly began, but to put it down in the exact right moment for all the decades since, except to complete work-related assignments. I endlessly began too, afraid to finish, just as my father was, in the shadow of the same old fear. The ghost KGB keep tabs on what is theirs. My fear and my father's, the knowledge that they will come in the night, although I'm working on it. I have more tools. I say that is my great grace, that I have all those tools when my father had nothing except a wooden stave he broke off a tree in case of any danger, because he walked on train tracks through the night, because he had no money for the train. I clench my fingers around the wooden stave sometimes, or curl them around my grandmother's horsewhip. These are the expressions of my two genders, my inheritances that did not make it through war and migration in any material form. Number 8. In the war, I'm given to understand, great-grandmother Rosa stole potatoes. This is how they survived. My grandmother Sofia and Borya, her twin, stood by the pot as the water boiled. I am given to understand that great-great-grandmother Sprinze stood by the same stove, and she picked up the peels of the stolen potatoes and made for herself some kind of latkes. Later, from the future of the 50s and her blindness, she yelled "Gedenk" in Yiddish, but nobody remembers what she wanted us to remember. Sometimes I yell "Gedenk" when nobody can hear me, "Gedenk" through the thick walls of my office or in my head. And that's all I have to remember. Sometimes the latkes. I wrote this book between 2017, after my dad died, and 2021. This poem, which is numbered 9, I published in Uncanny Magazine. And the year after, the war in Ukraine broke out. And in many ways, I predicted it, I feel, with this poem. Here it goes. I unzip my body like a big soft sack, looking for more things to sell. That's how grandmother Saya survived the war. When I was born, she wasn't fat, just her skin sagging over treasures sold in hunger. A big emptiness where all had once been. Words, family, an open window with its freshly starched lace curtain. Big cherry trees that began to bloom again after the war ended, the sour cherries as big and bloody as a fist. She told me once there was a tangle of gold, rings and necklaces inside her, watches from all the grandfathers and their dead. In the war, they ate turnips and stale bread, zipping and unzipping the burlap of her stomach. I eat because I do not remember what it's like not to live in the shadow of that war, what it's like to have security, believing that one's house will continue to stand unburned, believing that people live in houses and not in the backs of carts or on the floors of airports, at best in apartments shared with 2 other families, believing that one sleeps in beds rather than on top of toppled armoires or on the ground. One cannot labor enough to escape the narrative. This is my self-care. I unzip my skin, take out my own treasures, a tallow candle, gold protuberances of the sun, letters that peeled from desecrated Torah scrolls, my lenience towards the dirt and grime, and I put it all in poems, or, when the guilt gets too much, into turnips, my contribution to the long, long recovery from the war I have not seen, but which I am still fleeing, even as people here voted it in. My body can't cooperate. I stop sleeping. I eat my way through farmers' markets, gift boxes, donation boxes, the pantry, the cafeteria. I eat my way through sleeplessness and fear, waiting for that knock on the door or the announcement on the radio, shuddering with every familiar turn of phrase in languages new to me. And yet I continue. Inhabiting houses, making elaborate dishes out of turnips. I buy ever-expanding clothes. I do not know how to deal with all this. I am overwhelmed. I am self-hating. I am grateful. I am prescient. The world keeps changing in old familiar ways. The war forever looking to return. People cheering it on as if nobody ever learned anything. Somewhere, Grandmother Sia's cherry trees are still in bloom. I tell myself that I will go on. I'll just keep expanding until I outgrow even the Great War and all my migrations, until it is safe enough to be small. But I know that my smallness has never been safe, has never felt right, even when it was praised for trying, and I am done destroying myself for the sake of that anxiety of needing to look as if nothing ever happened. And I am strong, knowing that I must speak of yet worse things, zipping and unzipping the soft cavern of my stomach. I think to round this out, I'm going to read 2 more poems from towards the end of the book. 26. In Vorkuta, when I was 10, my father told me this story. A man walked the streets in Arctic winter without any gloves on. He'd been tortured in the Gulag decades prior, and since then he couldn't feel the cold, but only in his hands. The rest of him was bundled like the others in a sheepskin touloup, big hat, fur boots, 3 pairs of trousers. And he was cheerful, greeting the shocked newcomers, greeting my father as he hurried on, barehanded through the endless polar night. I never saw this man, but I think of him now as Kansas freezes and unfreezes endlessly in winter, the clutch of extreme weather, going from autumn pleasantness to blizzards in a span of a breath. My hands, more often than not, are gloveless. Why won't you put your gloves on? Asked my partner, my therapist, and I don't know what I'm doing or how to explain the comfort in pain of that old frostbite rising to the surface of my skin and how my hands clench stiff around the old words, the pain, dull, sharp, dull again, 20 times this winter. And I'm not cheerful, but I know that gloved, I wouldn't be writing this or writing anything. I'd be absorbed into this world, integrated into society, into this wet, stagnant ground, like the permafrost is thawing. And the last poem I'll read is number 27. These days, Vorkuta is the fastest emptying city in Europe. Winter grasps and fizzles. The townspeople leave for the south. There is no other direction. The endless apartment buildings, rows upon rows, in the old Soviet subdivision stand empty or barely occupied and impossible to heat, so the city closes down the building street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, relocating all that remain and repeat again. Pipes burst in flood freeze cycles like screamed waves or stalagmites. This was my old apartment building, the stairway where I would run out after a fight with my mother, trying to flee, but it was too cold. This was the kitchen where once I looked out to the tundra in bloom. Most people I know have a more tangible childhood. An old playground, a school, a reunion, a yearbook, a cleaved tree around the corner. All I know that there was a spaceship waiting for me at the foot of the Ural Mountains, out there in the distance, in the blue and pink light. The end began innocently enough. They closed the coal mines in the early 90s, among them Khalmyr, a small mining town where my father had installed just a few years prior a carved space divider for the miners' cafeteria. It was made of dozens of square panels of light-colored wood, carved in intricate radial designs. A year of his work or more in stark darkness, and then the incessant slanted light of polar summer. But everything thaws. This was my father's great work. Who knows what happened to it? Everything was stolen or sold off or left to decay and rot. Perhaps it is still there, a ghost of his life, his art, in the ghost town of Khalmyr. My mother has a photograph somewhere, but she isn't sharing. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arvi. When I when Larry sent me the manuscript, and it was one of those manuscripts you're immediately involved in. It is immediately immersed and drawn into it just after the very first lines. And hearing you read it now has been, thank you for bringing me back. It speaks of so much sadness and hurt, and at the same time, what was always making me cry, and I cried a lot when I was reading your book for the first time, was this prevailing humanity that comes through, that continues to suffer, that there are moments of these the wide open permafrost sky, and the Northern Lights is one of the passages that have been with me ever since I read it. Yeah, thank you for putting all this into these beautiful words.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah.
Abby,
Roger.
thank you so much. When I received your book, Larry was kind enough to send it to me, I immediately devoured it and felt many of the things that Julie has articulated so well. Just the authenticity, the honesty, the pain, and the images, and the food, the turnips and the latkes and the potatoes. And we get the sense of people who can't take food for granted, who have been through situations where their issue is not which wonderful restaurant will I eat in tonight, but will I eat it all? And I think so many of the images that you brought forward, the zipping and unzipping the burlap of her stomach, it's just, or the gloveless hands, and the way you articulate feeling into movement between numbness and pain. And just, I mean, obviously each of these moments to me speaks of how your poetry is trying to create images and give voice to what was despised or overpowered or lost. And I think you do an incredible job of recovery. This world that comes alive, even almost in the cry of, Gadonk. I mean, I don't even know what Gadonk means, maybe thank you or something, but, or like, like the words themselves start becoming more like not meanings, but really cries from the heart. And I think that's a great quality of your poetry. So I just thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your kind words.
You're the best I could. And so did you.
I never know how to respond to such amazing praise, and I'm blessed by your words. Gedenk simply means remember. In Yiddish, it's the imperative of remember.
Okay.
And nobody knows what she wanted us to remember. We just remember. I mean, I've not met her, but my mother met her as when my mother was very small, and all she remembers is the endless yelling, "Gedenk, gedenk."
Right.
And it had to be something about the war. It had to be, but nobody remembered what it was. And I think so many things after these traumatic events, these ruptures, are remembered, and they're told, but only in fragments. I often think how long it takes to, what recovery even means, and what healing even means, and how deeply generations, not just single people, but generations are traumatized. I recently wrote a poem in which I, there are lines about how people make soap out of fragments of ends of hard soap. And this is a memory from when we immigrated to Israel. We had nothing. We were refugees. And this elderly man, neighbor, who was an Auschwitz survivor, he said, "I have a present for you." And he brought out this gigantic soap artifact, I don't know how to describe it, that painstakingly over the years he was putting together from the ends of the soaps, because he was so deeply traumatized by what happened to him that he couldn't throw out the ends of the soaps. And this was his heartfelt gift to us, this sculpture. So it's really, you know, it's really striking, and this image will forever be with me because nobody knew what to do with it.
I suspect you will.
Go ahead.
So extraordinary image.
I wanted to go back to the Gedenk, seeing that we are all Jewish poets, and how the Gedenk is this remember, you know, that is so prevalent in Judaism, and how it is contrasted, RB, in your book with the title of Everything Thaws. Could you maybe speak a little to remembering and thawing as sort of elements of a mourning process, which is what I think is also happening on those pages, among many other things, of course.
Thank you for this question, Julia. You know, I think about my family and memory a lot of times in terms of silences and what was unspeakable, what was absolutely not speakable. And how much of what I'm saying is an argument against the silence. You're supposed to remember, but not to speak. So how will you remember if you don't speak? You know, how will you make sense of things if there are things that you absolutely cannot talk about? You're hearing the stories, but then what are you going to do with those stories? You hear them maybe once, maybe twice, because somebody, you know, had a sleepless night or is having a bit of a difficult time, and suddenly they tell you the story, and what are you going to do with it? So the thawing process for me is, you know, all the things that I've been through as a child and a teen, moving between all these places, being a refugee, you know, being hungry a lot of times. All of these memories speak things that are uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable to me, they're uncomfortable to my family, maybe. They're uncomfortable in the context of what does it mean in terms of my identity. It's not a linear story. It was never supposed to be a linear story. It's not a story that teaches a moral lesson. It's just life. And I think there is something so rich and powerful in about melting and not being frozen with these thoughts, memories, and images, but rather letting them heal you through often really, really painful way of talking about them and writing one poem and another poem and another poem and trying to make sense of it all, and then talking about it and maybe changing your mind. And there's something very powerful in it. And for me, the process of thawing is really a process of how do we heal from trauma. And for me, it doesn't mean that we forget it. It means that we remember, and we remember how we used to be. And maybe not everything needs to be 100% truly and accurately remembered for it to make internal sense and for it to allow us to move forward while still being very much aware of all the things that happened, not just to me in this case, but to members of my family and to you know, to the Jewish people, and recognizing that we are, each one of us is a small part of a very long story, and remembering that perhaps is enough.
Yeah. Roger, I want to hand it over to you for a last question to RB in just a sec. I do want to mention one thing that I've been feeling and thinking about a lot when reading your book, but also in general in my life. You know, thawing is often associated with a positive thing, with healing, with beginning to speak, even though it is painful. ending the frozenness, this kind of silence. And at the same time, when I think of thawing, I also think of things going away, things vanishing. And I think that there is this fine line that makes your book so poignant about, while you start writing about things that have been sort of not, have been silenced, at the same time, by bringing them out, they're kind of also thawing away. It's not really a question. It's more a comment about this double-sidedness of the thawing.
Thank you so much for this beautiful question/comment. I think you're absolutely right. I think in everything thaw is not necessarily positive, because the image of the permafrost melting has to do with climate change, and it's not a very good thing. In fact, it's a terrible thing, because of course, it reveals buried secrets that we maybe didn't want to be revealed, but it also causes, climate change catastrophic events such as storms and tornadoes, but it also allows, for example, the Russian Federation to place military fortifications where they haven't been before. And we really, the only people who want them there is the Russian Federation army. And of course, now after I finished the book and it was accepted, it came out 2023, but I finished it in 2021. And of course, a year after, as the book went to print, Russian Federation, in fact, did attack Ukraine and is complicit in a lot of terrible things around the world. And I often think how much climate change benefits the powers that be in the Russian Federation, but not anybody else very much, and how much that can be used in order to further these, military goals, which result in tremendous human suffering. So thaw is not always positive. And in this case, it is a double-edged gift. Like it's a Pandora's box. Like we open it and then we need to see what's inside. And one poem that is kind of the key poem in many ways in the cycle that I haven't had the chance to read is about how I almost died on the crossing between Vorkuta Center and my school and our then apartment. And one of the things that I talked about in that poem, how people freeze every year. They die of exposure and they are just covered by snow, and they're sometimes found again, sometimes not found again. And then the process of thaw reveals them, but it doesn't bring them back to life.
Right. Wow.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, so it's not a one directional story. It has complexity that I don't think we need to resolve and again draw conclusions. It just is.
Yeah, absolutely. Roger.
Yeah, I mean, I think you had the phrase, I think you had the phrase in the first poem, remembering a town no one believes exists, something like that. And it feels like our memory is so fragile. And so I feel a link between memory and this issue of thawing versus freezing. The man who doesn't wear gloves so he can remember his pain. So freezing actually is a way for him to remember his pain. But the other dynamic works as well, that ice, frozenness, and I know, well, I do this thing with dreams, and it very often ice and frozenness really refers to frozen feeling. And when the ice melts and you see a person start to see the ice melt, that's this allowing the feelings to flow, so as water. So I think that dynamic is in the poetry, and nice to point out the kind of tension between that and the climate disaster, which is also that the ground we're walking on is disappearing. There's so much in your work because it goes so deep into experiences that that I suppose many of us escaped or avoided. Let's say it that way.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We will come back maybe as we wrap up this conversation and can talk about more questions that arise. For now, we are turning to Roger Kamenetz, who is going to read also for about 20 minutes. Roger Kamenetz is a poet and Jewish thinker who focuses on the sacred encounter in dreams for spiritual growth. He is Professor Emeritus of English and Religious Study at Louisiana State University and the author of 15 books of poetry and prose. His work has been called a quote, subtle and intelligent surrealism, immersive, hypnotic, hilarious, wise, and heartbreaking. Best known for The Jew in the Lotus, he wrote the poems in the anthology The Missing Jew over the course of almost 50 years. The Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai has called them, quote, very exciting and original poems, a secret and almost intimate meeting place of English and Hebrew. Please.
Thank you. When we were talking ahead of this meeting, and really one of the joys of doing this is a chance to hang out with Julia and RV and just talk. I mentioned that I didn't say it this way, but I'm sort of a pseudo-Ukrainian Jew because as a boy, my grandparents were silent about the past. My grandfather, David Kamenetz, didn't specify where he was from. And so I looked on a globe I had, and there was this town called Kamenets-Podolsk, which is in western Ukraine, the capital Podolia. So I decided I must be from there, and created this whole mythology about it. And I think, I'm thinking about my own life. I really think books and a relationship to books, the world of words, was really there from the beginning. I think my earliest memory was a mistake in reading. I was sitting in first grade and I saw the letters I and S, and I said, oh, that's eyes. So I think that's why I'm a poet, because of that. And so I wanted to read a poem that's actually not from the book Julia edited, but from The Lowercase Jew that came out in 2003. It just feels right to read. Grandfather Clause. It's for David Kamenetz, Zikron Bracha. If only you'd done what you'd been told to do. If only you'd not been lifted by a chance wind west above the wheat tips of Ukraine, the thunder of Nauts, the Cossacks shouting. If you had stayed instead to be murdered, the Einsatzgruppen, old men like you, fingers palsied on the trigger, bellies shaking at the recoil, would have shot you dead at the edge of a pit, slaughtered you on the outskirts of a town Jews could not enter after sundown. There is a clause that refers to you in the inner lining of a foreign language, where Jew is the dirtiest word ever. This clause, prepared in advance of your name, is the secret history of your death, decreed in a grammar strange to your Yiddish, as the language I speak is still inflected by the death that might have been. Yet you entered America like a pilgrim or a germ. Which was it? Or both, as America decided, with your Jewish heart and lungs and your Jewish disease and 2 strong fingers and a needle. Why should I tell that old story again? I'm still immigrating into this moment, learning that the words applied to you apply to me. Even after all this time, I will not allow anyone to annihilate your name and mine. I am grandfathered in. So I made a mistake because I promised to start my timer so that I wouldn't overstep my limit. But
Don't worry, I start mine.
Julia will tell me. Okay. So I want to read a poem about mourning in Jerusalem a long time ago. And Julia had prompted me to read this work. And it's called The Circulation of the Mourners. And there's a quote from Jeremiah who says, "And they have built the shrines of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in fire, which I never commanded, which never came to my mind." That's speaking for God. So, as prophets are wont to do. So, if you know Jerusalem, you know that around the old city, there's a rather deep valley, and that's the Valley of Hinnom. It's where Gehenna, one of the names for Jewish hell, comes from. It's really not a very well-developed piece of real estate, but it was the site where Moloch was worshipped by burning children. And so I refer in the poem to the old God and the new God, and I guess you can figure out which is which. The old God walked in the crevice in a narrow valley of smoke and fire, while the new God hovered between the tips of wings. Mourners circled the outer wall of the new God, who lived in a secret house within a house of prayer, though no one spoke his name. The mourners circled clockwise, non-mourners counterclockwise, or was it the other way around? Written in the book, either way, while the old God walked with eyes on the ground. "How down to earth is our old God," his worshippers sang. "How practical and implacable. Never lifts his eyes, even to the face of the child we burn. This is how a God should be, though," some said. "He searches for something lost in the ground." "Then let us bring him gold along with the child." And the old God seemed pleased, while the new God waited for animal blood to splash against his clean white walls. The mourners circled slowly counterclockwise, while sweet smoke of the old God rose from the narrow valley to mingle with smoke of the new. When I saw a mourner circling opposite, I knew just how to greet her. But we were all mourners in the valley, all blind confusion in the smoke. When the temple broke its walls and priests spilled into the soldiers' spears, they say the new God rose straight into the sky, leaving the cherubs' wings bare, cherubs we made of fire and gold. Now the old God lives in the house among cracked basins and broken columns, a haunter of ruins, while the new God mourns in the valley of broken children. Bits of white stone have tumbled into the valley of smoke and fire, where bits of white bone are buried. It is all written in the book, some say. Someday I hope to read to my child. Unfortunately, in the book that Larry brought into the world, it's not working. So, okay, anyway, you can't see it because I have this tricky thing, but there it is. The Missing Jew, poems 1976 to 2022. And I see here tonight also my dear old friend, Merrill Leffler, who was the godfather of the original edition that came out in 1979. So thank you, Merrill. It's wonderful that we're still here. So there's a section on mourning, and it's called Shiva. So I'm going to read a poem from there. In a time of mourning. Some kinds of darkness are whispers, some are gray. I would not pretend to know all the colors of darkness. The ones I've seen are enough for this life. Ghosts without color or form reach out their fingers. I've been ordered to sleep in a bed of quilts like a sick child. Was this the dream my mother had for me? I would have her dream for herself. A stream of iron clouds passes overhead, continuously dank and gray. Prisoners of form, we lie awake in our circles and squares. The darkness seeps into our thoughts like smoke. It fills out everyday gestures with night. When the true shadows of night invade the house, I am unable to sleep. Restless, I call out your name, Mother. Mother of darkness, I am in mourning for tomorrow. So this poem is called Practice Heaven, and it was written on a plane to China on June 19th, 2016. Practice heaven. This means practice the feelings you would have in heaven. Practice them now while you are still alive. Practice living in harmony and grace. Drink the milk of paradise and eat the honeydew. Be kind. Look into the depths of things. Respect the world inside each person. Respect the angelic in the person. Listen for the angelic and amplify it. Return indifference with curiosity. Be gentle in word and gesture, gentle in speech, gentle hands and gentle tongue. Live each moment. Live the past as the shadow behind you, but walk in the sun. Walk to the light. Love the light in each one. Love the one in each one. See unity and simplicity. See the curve of the eyebrow and the rainbow. Hear the human voice in the sparrow. Feel the sparrow bones in the child's hand. Be gentle with the imagination of children. Love as the child loves. Cry as the child cries. Follow your way. Consult the sensations in your body. Practice heaven. Wake from your dreams into dream. Know you have choice. See compulsion for what it is, cruelty and violence. Never say what you always say, but only what the moment requires. Breathe the air as the air of heaven and be grateful. Let thank you be your prayer and speak to God through persons. So I'm going to read a sequence of poems that span 2003, 2014, and they are all related to incidents between Israel and Hamas. The first poem, Jerusalem Bus, the date that I'll mention at the end was the date this event happened, where a bus full of Orthodox children who have been visiting the wall, a bomb was planted on it filled with ball bearings so that many people as possible would be injured. And Hamas claimed responsibility for this crime. Jerusalem Bus. And there's an epigraph from Eric Auerbach's book, Mimesis, where he's talking about the quality, the bareness of Hebrew literature as compared to Greek literature. The use of metonymy in Hebrew literature as compared to metaphor in Greek literature. So he's describing the scene where Abraham is sacrificing Isaac and how plain it is. And the quote is, "They are serving man, ass, wood, knife, and nothing else." Jerusalem Bus. So much darkness allows bandages to be undone, allows wounds to smoke in the open air, allows wheels of the bus to touch ruptured road, allows tires to burn into the sky, allows smells to penetrate, the smell of burnt hair, smell of blood, smell of tongues still moist in closed mouths, the smell of it all. So much darkness and none has light. There's no life in the dark, no stars in the imagined sky. Jerusalem goes black. The deaths have used up the air. There is nothing but the nothing. My accident is your opportunity, said death to life. And life could not answer. Life mute as a scar. Did anyone turn to the sunset and pray? Who would be stolen by the next breath? Did a baby actually lie with his eye to the ground? Did his mother, who had held him in her lap, leave a tear near the milk? These questions are cruel. Tomorrow will be another day entirely, but this day will always be burnt. August 19th, 2003. This poem was later reprinted in two places. It was reprinted in, I'm not sure the date, 2014 or 2016, after another bus bombing in the Times of Israel. And it was also printed in a magazine produced by some friends here in New Orleans who are Egyptian. And the magazine was called MENA, which means Ports of Call, and was published in both New Orleans and Egypt, in Alexandria, translated into Arabic. This poem is dated July 8th, 2014. It's called The Necessary Killings. And this was during one of the incursions of the state of Israel into Gaza. So history is obviously keeps repeating itself. So this is called The Necessary Killings. We must kill them, the president said, because they're killing us before we can kill them. In that case, said the other president, why don't we kill them yesterday? In which case their children won't have a chance to grow up. We tried that before, said the president, but their children spilled on the floor and made a mess difficult to clean up. They trampled them so. What color was the mess? Asked the reporter. You know, the president said, his head turning bright red with rage, the color of stop signs. Then why didn't you stop? Said the other president. There you have it, said the president. The color was delicious. That's probably against the law, said the giant media head. Her television was full of eyes and ears. Many people underfoot clamored to be heard, but their voices added up to a whisper, so they could hardly be seen. And one more, and after this, I'll read, if there's time, I'll read another. I'm not sure if there's time. Is there time, timekeeper?
There is about 3-ish minutes, if we
Three.
go.
Okay, then I'll just read this one. Okay.
I mean,
That's okay, that's fine.
ish.
Ish, I get it. Ish is ish. I'll read this last one. It's called The War Shop. You advertise the mother of all wars. I know, but we're out of stock. Would you like a brother-in-law of some wars? What's that? It's a smaller war, of course, but can be ended more easily. Will it wipe them out completely? Will it be the end of all trouble with them? You know, let's get rid of them once and for all. That is what I've been telling people. Oh, the old warkeeper said with a smile. That's an oldie but goodie. Haven't heard that one in a while. You mean the war to end all wars? Right. The mother thing was a slip because I'm so angry my enemy confuses me. The warkeeper shook his head. He wore an apron behind the counter. I'm sorry, I can't guarantee that. In fact, I never guarantee that. Why not? Said the angry customer. Because once you unseal the package, sometimes thousands of arms and legs come without bodies, or cheeks with holes in them. Tanks get stuck in the mud, rifles won't fire, children wail, then go silent. Well, then we should have the right of return. Can't we return the war if it's defective? No right of return. The angry customer was climbing on the counter and looked down on the bald, shiny head of the warkeeper. Sir, said the warkeeper, could you please keep your anger on the other side? It's an explosion, the angry customer said, climbing back down and lying on the floor. Blood ran along the line between his scalp and forehead. Well, it's making a big mess, said the warkeeper. Do you have any smart bombs? The angry customer said, but his voice was becoming fainter. Or do you just have the dumb ones? He lay on his back on the checkerboard floor, and his blood formed streams and rivers. He sank into the black and white floor, and all his thoughts were black or white. Far away, he saw black hills at the border and airstrikes trailing white clouds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. There's so many things that I could, and what I could mention. I do want to say two things. One, Ukraine came up again. So Ukraine and Israel, countries that are close to us for several reasons. Countries that are very close to RB, who has lived in both,
Right.
are at war. And that is one thing I wanted to mention. And in a way, we are all mourners, which is why the circling of the mourners I resonated with me when I read through the section of grief in your book, which is a big section. And what I find so poignant about this, one of those, laws from the Talmud, like how mourners are circling, and at certain festivals they can go, but they have to be made visible that they are mourners by going into the other direction than the rest of the people are doing. Is this one of the things that I find so, it's so tangible and it's so poignant, and I thought it is a good expression for where, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but many of us, I think, are in mourning in one way or the other, related to what's going on on all sides of wherever we are on. So to bring this into a poem, it was just so good, and I'm glad that you read it. Many people have said in the wake of October 7th that there are no words. There are no words. We cannot write about it. And I myself have felt like this, but largely because, as you also mentioned, and as RB also mentioned when they were talking, is it has all happened before. History repeats itself. These poems that you just read, right? They could be from all sorts of on the timeline, on this continuum of timeline. And I'm in rabbinical school, so I'm studying a lot, and I open Torah and I cannot look every parsha. It's war, and it's this guy goes into Gaza and destroys. Like, it's been going on for so long. How are there words? What can I write? What hasn't been felt before? How, I want to ask you, Roger, how do you relate to that? Have you, do you experience something like this? Do you not? How do you deal with it?
I don't think I could write a poem right now about this, what's going on, but I wrote a poem about it 9 years ago, which 2 of them, which I read to you.
Right.
And they express for me very much, so much of what I would want to say, but wouldn't know how to say right now. And it, there's a theory, there's a Hebrew poetics that poetry comes when the Ruach HaKodesh rests on the poet. And it's said that the Ruach HaKodesh cannot rest on a person who's angry.
Mm-hmm.
The consequence of that is that they say that Prophet Jeremiah, who wrote about the destruction of Jerusalem, wrote it ahead of time because as a witness to the destruction, he would not have been able to access the Ruach HaKodesh. Now, I'm not comparing myself in any way to that, but I'm just saying I do think that when people are angry and combative, they can write amazing poems. I'm not discounting that, but for my process, it's not the case. And I was stunned by your kind of through a series of mishaps, you're choosing that circulation poem because I don't even remember when I wrote it, but it was a long time ago. But when I read it, I said, okay, well, it's finally found its moment. For me, it gives a sense of this battle within us between two gods.
And we're circling Jerusalem in a way. I mean, not.
And what, right.
Having just been there, having lived on top of Gehinnom Valley.
Okay.
And thinking about
a
lot. So, yeah.
Well, I feel it more as the fact that, as Levinas says in this amazing text, Totality and Infinity, Levinas is a Lithuanian Jew who ended up as a French prisoner of war of the Nazis as a French soldier. And he says, when war happens, there's no morality. It's all bets are off. Everything that we thought we believed or thought was true is gone. And I think that's the situation. And so violence, well, Heraclitus, violence is the God and King of all. So which God are we choosing?
Yep.
We can choose, but which God? And we can get them confused. I think was part of it. But I think the images were saying that to me. I don't know what they said to anyone else, but I got to listen to it as a first time in a way because I hadn't read it in 20 years. So
yeah.
So thank you.
It was prophetic or haphazard. It's about how I often feel about poetry, that you write something and mention something along that too, that we write something and we have a sense, may not have happened yet, but we have a sense that it happened and then it does happen. I have that when I write sometimes. I could tell in both of what RB was speaking about her poem, about the war and what you have just said, that comes up for me a lot in the poetry writing process, is that I feel like I'm writing about something that I know has happened but it hasn't yet. But it is a way of making sense or trying to get through wherever I need to get through. But I want to give RB the chance also to react. And I also want to encourage people. We have another 15 minutes of our time. I'm sure the poets, if we have 5 more minutes, we end up at 6, like at 5 after. But do put some questions in the chat. What do you want to ask? And then in the meantime, RB, please.
Roger, thank you so much for your powerful reading. I love your work and I love this collection, The Missing Jew. So if anybody doesn't have it yet, I encourage you to get it. I want to talk a little bit about this secret history of your grandfather's death, and the thoughts that you had about his life in Ukraine, which then you found that maybe he's not from Ukraine at all. And that really resonated with me, both the kind of the imagery of being from there and staying there and experiencing deaths that some were real and some were imagined, and how memory, in a way, memory does not, I also grappled with this, how the memory doesn't have to be accurate, because it is how we feel about these histories that is our own, and it belongs to us just as much as it maybe belongs to our ancestors, who of course knew the intimate details of their lives, and they knew where they came from, and we might not know that because there have been so many ruptures and disruptions in Jewish history, migrations and relocations and wars, and all of those continues, unfortunately. So we might not always be able to know the intimate details of our family lives, even our grandparents, but there is a sense of mourning for their deaths, and there's this sense of deep belonging to this kind of continuity of mourners. I love your poem that you read about mourning, The Circle of Mourners, and I keep returning to this poem and keep thinking about how in my synagogue, the synagogue that I now belong to, I used to be modern Orthodox. I'm not modern Orthodox. I belong to a non-denominational synagogue in Lawrence, Kansas, which is lovely. And there's a custom when they say, mourners, please rise for the mourners Kaddish. And those whose custom it is to rise can also rise. And in the beginning, because I came from a modern Orthodox background, I would not rise for the mourners Kaddish unless it was my morning, my place to read the mourners Kaddish. But then over the years, I started to get up and I started to read the Kaddish with the other readers. And it struck me first how different these customs are and how different Jewish people are. But also it struck me how poignant this became for me, that we are all mourners. And every time there's mourning, we can participate in it with an open heart, either for victims of today or victims of the past, or people that we care about and people we don't even know. And for me, it can be Jewish and non-Jewish people. And I think in the current war, I don't want to differentiate the pain, because I am very connected to ideas of pain and sitting with and just with feelings of learning about other people through the pain that they experience. And mourning is such a profound thing. So thank you very much for these poems that you shared about mourning. And it's such a Jewish thing too, although of course it's universal to mourn. Even animals can mourn, and of course every kind of people mourn. But there's something very Jewish about the process of mourning.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to sound. I think I like the way we Jews do mourning. I think there's something really profound about it, and communal and beautiful. The town of Kamenets-Podolsk was a place where Jews weren't allowed after sundown, and it's a place Rebbe Nachman visited, and it's a place I visited, and it was a place where in 1941, before the Nazis had gotten into the technology of using gas and gas chambers, they had old men known as Einsatzgruppen, and they lined all the Jews of Kamenets or the surrounding area in a pit, and they shot them into the pit. And that's a true story. So since my grandfather left in 1905, at the time of Teddy Roosevelt, he escaped all that. That's what I was suggesting, that I'm from the people who escaped, but interestingly didn't want to remember what he escaped. He was done with it in a certain way, and he started a new life. So he didn't share tales from the old country or the old days at all. And so I was left to puzzle out the significance of my name. And, it was after my grandfather died in 1974 that I began to write the poems that were the first missing Jew. And then obviously missing Jew has that meaning as well. So I think a lot of my poems are poems of mourning, but at the same time, I hope that they are uplifting in some way. So
I find poems that are about grief and about loss. I find them uplifting in the sense that I feel beauty and the vastness of our lives and the universe and time, which is also just, you know, when you say the way we do mourning in Judaism, it is so elaborate and it has so much to do with the notion of time, what happens on the first, the third, the seventh, the 30th day, right? All of these things are just beautiful. So for me, poetry, that is the poetry I write, and that is the poetry I most first and foremost resonate with, gives mourning and grief and loss a forum, a space, something. So so definitely reading poems about mourning, even though they are about mourning, they do help to be held in the feelings that we are going through. So I definitely want to say that they're uplifting in that, because they go to such depth that we feel like to be able to resonate. One person, Esther, was writing in the chat, it feels, I don't see it here, but something along the lines, it is good to feel those words in my ears. She wrote, feel those words in my ears. So I think that goes along with what I want to say.
Right. Feel the words. Yeah.
Yeah. I am looking in the chat. Elizabeth wrote, Israeli poets have been writing poignant poetry in real time since October 7th. I wonder if we post-Holocaust diaspora Jews know how to mourn the tragedies of the past, but are struggling to find words and process today's tragedy. Thank you, Elizabeth. Do either of you want to respond to that?
You know, I know a lot of Israeli poets, and not everybody's writing poems right now. Some are and some aren't. I know when the Ukraine war started, in the first few weeks of the war, Ukrainian poets wrote just incredible, very, very poignant and very moving poetry. And that's how I kind of got into translation, and that was a very healing process for me, where I reconciled a lot of my history, which involves very, very painful anti-Semitism that I survived, that my family survived, and present-day Ukraine, because, you know, some of my family, as I narrate in Everything Tolls, some of my family was killed by Ukrainian perpetrators, collaborators with the Nazi regime, and some were killed by Nazis. But others were killed by Ukrainian neighbors. They were killed by neighbors. And so, of course, my family had to flee, and Israel was the only place that we could go at the time. But I saw these poems, and I saw just this incredible outpouring of amazing poetry from Ukrainian community, and I got into translation. I translated it. And now there's still really, really moving poetry, but the speed of poetry is not coming as fast as it was in the first time when the war started. I think people are getting very, very exhausted, and I am sure they will continue writing, and a lot of amazing writing already happens and will happen. But as the war continues, the war in Ukraine, you know, Russia's full-scale invasion continues on its destructive path. People are exhausted, just overwhelmed, and the trauma is overwhelming. But I'm sure that there will be more art coming from this. And when I think about, you know, the response that I've seen from Israeli literary community, I've seen some really powerful work, and I've seen people who are not ready. They're not ready because There are some very complex feelings there. This is not a, this is a very complex thing, and it's you know, it's incredibly painful. And I am, you know, again, just for me, I have been reading works of Palestinian poets and Palestinian authors for many, many years, because I believe that the way that we understand each other and sit with each other is through our poetry. These are the, you know, other ways too, but these are the best ways to get to know each other. Some of the best ways to get to know each other. And I also see some people are writing and some people just are not able to say anything because the trauma is so great. So I think that both things are true. And there are definitely people now who are writing there and in diaspora. Um, and there are people who need time to process, and I think that's fine. I mean, as a person who still writes poems about the Holocaust, which I have never seen, trauma takes a very long time to digest. It's not necessarily a thing that expires, unfortunately.
Thank you. Glenn is asking a question. When you hear a poet read a poem, do you ever want to write a poem in response, either to ask more questions or posit answers? It's
Yeah. Yes. So first of all, that's true. That when you read a poem by someone, sometimes it's just a line, and usually it's a line that's indigestible. That would stimulate me to write a poem. It's not what I understand. That's not going to make me want to write a poem, but it's what I really sense there's something there, but I don't quite know what it is, and I'm troubled by it, and that would stimulate it. And I would also say there's a, I would call it auto midrash, where when you write these peculiar and strange things, and they seem right, but you yourself don't understand them, often those lines or those passages can then immediately or later on stimulate new poems as kinds of midrashic responses. So I almost view midrash is usually seen as simply commentary, but I actually view it as a poetic process of regeneration, of generating something new from what's already been laid down. And so you can certainly have that relationship to your own work as long as you avoid writing like a journalist and making everything utterly clear. That's always a mistake, I think. So if you can avoid that to some extent, then you're going to find some mysterious things in your work to work from. I wanted to respond a little bit to Elizabeth's question too, and just to say that you know, I'm not aware of the poems that are coming out of Israel, and I'd be curious to learn more about that. But you know, I feel that I stand in a certain relationship to Israel as an American Jew. I feel great sense of connection. I recognize that half the world's Jews live in Israel, and that my fate is bound with theirs. In some ways, their fate is bound with ours. But the approach has to be somewhat different. It's really different to be in Israel and to hear the bombs falling, and your life is under threat, and your loved ones are on the front, or they've been kidnapped. Or I mean, this is just, how could I possibly pretend to write? I have to write from where I am and what I know, and so it's a different approach. It has to be, and I think there's a certain poet I won't name who didn't live in New Orleans and took it upon, I'll say, themselves to write a book about Katrina, and they didn't know shit about Katrina, but they, or the environment or anything. So, but it was like, oh, it's in the news, I'm gonna write it. So I don't, that's not a reputable approach. So we have to write from our own situation.
Yeah. Yeah, Elizabeth mentioned that they are not necessarily translated yet. Just as
Okay.
to learn more about, not to respond to the first half of what you were saying. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's probably another urgency when you're really in Israel, and us here looking from afar takes way longer to process it in a way, and as it will also take for those in Israel. Probably there's an urgency to respond maybe right now and here, but I think there will be other poetry potentially then coming out after, as RB said, how it
Right.
lasts long, how trauma lasts a long time. And it is, we're at the, we at our time. And I've always been fascinated, having grown up in Germany, speaking German, that coincidentally or not, the word for trauma is trauma. And the word for dream is Traum. It's, there's a connection that I want to leave you with. We cannot elaborate this now, but in terms of the processes that take time, that evolve inside us and potentially come out as poetry, they are similar. The dream, as was in your poem, actually, you know, you have a dream, and sometimes we associate it with something positive, but the dream that you're mentioning in the Time of Mourning poem, I think was that the dream my mother had for me. So
Right.
that is something about going back to the times of mourning, how Judaism sort of has elaborated the system that helps us go through that, as maybe, I think from what we've talked about tonight, poetry does too. Hopefully, it certainly has helped me to be here tonight with RB and Roger, with Larry, and with everyone who came on. I would be amiss if I didn't share yet again in the chat this mundane link for those who are interested in ordering our books at a special discount price. There's the link. Thank you. Thank you, Larry, for making this possible, for being Ben Yehuda Press, for publishing books like these. And thank you, RB, thank you, Roger, for coming on. And thanks everyone for joining. And I hope it was meaningful.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.